And we are recording. I got it on hold, so we are good. Yes, that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to be looking at what does it mean to be made in the image of God. Made in the image of God. Okay? So let's look at our verse, though, before we get too far into that. In chapter 1, starting again in verse 26, and it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." Alright, so we last time looked at, and I'm saying this for the sake of the people listening on the recorder, but we looked at last time again that we saw the council of deity, and God having somewhat of a council among himself in terms of the creation of man. He said, let us make man in our image, and we saw that as God communing among himself in the form of a Trinity. And so now we're going to look at the decision to make man, and we call this the crowning of man. Okay, so the council of deity and the crowning of dominion. And of course that crowning of dominion is that he is going to make a man, and that man will be made in his image. Okay, so it says here clearly that God made man in his own image. So what is the image that he's referring to? And there's really a lot of beliefs when it comes to what the image of God is. In fact, you could probably pick up 50 commentaries. And in those 50 commentaries, you'll probably have about 30 to 40 different explanations of what being made in God's image is. Now, I tell you what, I am very, 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 very confident in my view of what being made in God's image is. Not only that, let me just state it this way. I believe that these two verses, 26 and 27, are absolutely essential in understanding the Bible. These are not just passing verses. I believe that with a clear understanding of these verses, you really unlock the main emphasis of the New Testament. And really, more than anything, God's redemptive plan in restoring man back to God's intended purpose for him all centers around a right understanding of being made in God's image. In fact, I believe that I could spend the next 45 minutes trying to tell you just how important it is and leave giving you an understatement of his importance. So that's how I feel about these two verses. I very strongly believe that it's crucial to have a right understanding of what it means to be made in God's image. Could I have sold that any better? I wish I could, because I would keep trying to sell it if I could. Alright, so what does it mean to be made in God's image? Well, here's a few things that people say. Well, most people will say that it has to do with some way of us being made in God's attributes. You know, God has certain attributes that we have, and so since we possess these attributes in some way, then in that relationship we are made in His likeness. Now, before we get to that, just let me clarify this real quick, though. It says that He's made in His image and likeness. Okay, so is there a difference between being made in God's image and being made in God's likeness? There's not. There's not. This is a literary device that's used all the time in Hebrew literature. Okay, and it's what we call pleonasm. Everyone knows what pleonasm is? Anyone know what pleonasm is? Okay, so pleonasm is when you use redundant terms for emphasis. Okay, it's used also, if you look in chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made." Created and made is also a pleonasm. In other words, it means the exact same thing. It says that God made man. It says God created man. They're used interchangeably. Okay, so these terms are interchangeable terms, and they're given there to emphasize the importance of the act. Okay, so when we look at it, we need to pay attention to it. These redundant terms are purposeful to get us to go, wow, okay, this is something that we really need to focus on. Okay, does that everybody make sense with that? Okay. Okay, so being made in God's image. They'll say that it has to do with us being in some way made in God's attributes. So number one, they'll say that God is a rational being, and we are rational people. So in that way, we are made in God's image because we have rationale and logic, okay? And they'll measure us up against like the animals and the plants that don't have rationale or logic, right? But here's the problem with that, is I truly believe that this dominion... Oh, come on. Don't be sorry.
Come in.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah.
I'm going to grab those extra chairs in the schoolroom.
Yeah.
Welcome. Darian was saving seats just for you two guys. You see that? All right. So what we're doing, we're talking about what it means to be made in God's image. Okay, so there's all kinds of views on what it means to be made in God's image. I've already sold the group on how essentially important it is to have a right interpretation of what it means to be made in God's image. I believe that it's crucial for understanding the Bible. Okay, so we're looking at what some people might say is being made in God's image, or what that means. Okay, so we're looking at the fact that man is a rational being just like God is a rational being. Okay, but when we start to develop a idea of what it means to be made in God's image, we must understand that this being made in God's image is unique only to mankind. Okay, unique. It is nothing else in the universe is ever described as being made in God's image. Only man is. And it's talked about numerous of times throughout the Bible, okay? In various different ways. Numerous of times talked about God making man in His image, okay? And it's only, always contribute to man only, okay? So, if we're going to develop a right understanding of being made in God's image, then it can only be uniquely related to man, okay? So, is there any other being that God ever created in time that has a rational or a logic mind?
No.
You would all be wrong.
Then He made woman.
Well, no, woman's mankind.
It's not rational and logic.
Ooh, I'm going to leave that alone. You can't think of another being that God created that has angels. Do they have rationale and logic? Well, absolutely they do. Yeah, they commune with man. They use the same rationale that we do. Right? So, were angels made in God's image? Be hard-pressed to find that theologically. Alright? So we have to be careful with that. Okay, another thing that people say is that man was made a relational being. Just like God has the capacity for relationships. And man has the capacity for relationships. So in that regard, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And what's the problem with that? Animals have the capacity for a relationship, right? They, in a sense, they also have a capacity for rational logic, to be clear. Now, not to the same degree that man does. There's no doubt about that. But angels would. I mean, we'd have to agree that they have the same capacity for rational logic as we do, if not more. Dogs are relational beings. I don't think anyone would doubt that, right? But they don't understand the complexity of relationships like we do. But that might then go back to a rational or logic mind. But angels, when it comes to relationship, would be on the same par that man was. Anyone doubt that? All right. Okay, so there's a rational being, relationship. The other one is that, number 3, is that man is made with a moral recognition, okay? Which clearly would distinguish us from animals. There's no doubt about that, right? So, I had to beat my dog to get my dog to not get into the trash. And I love my dog, and I try to honor the proverb that tells us to care for our animals, but when it gets into my trash, it gets a beating, right? Because I don't want it to continue to do that behavior. But at no time will my dog go, you know what? My master does not want me to get into that trash. And I love my master, so I repent of this ungodly behavior. Does that ever do any of that? No, it just doesn't want to get beaten, right? So it's conditioned not to do things. It doesn't ever have a conscience in doing that, right? So we are completely different in that regard, because there's a lot of people who doesn't have a moral compass, so to speak. In other words, they don't follow a set of moral rules, but they know right from wrong. They don't go shoot their neighbor when they stay up too late, right? Because they know shooting their neighbor would be wrong. Right? Yeah, so man has in his own conscience a moral recognition. So does that distinguish him from all other created beings? Angels, again, we're failing, right? Because angels also have a moral recognition. In fact, they're called holy, right? So there is a moral recognition even among angels, okay? So here's the other one, and we'll spend a little bit of time with this one, just a little bit. But the other one is that there's a personal resemblance. A personal resemblance. And where they get this is that it is believed by those who hold this view that man is a trichotomy. Okay, so I am not arguing either pro or against the trichotomy about man at this point. I will get into that when we get into chapter 2. So that is not my argument here. But we want to recognize that this really has nothing to do with the image of God. And I'll give you several reasons for that. First of all, what does it mean that man is a trichotomy? When someone holds to that view, what are they essentially saying? Anybody know? Ever heard of trichotomy before? Okay.
Tracheotomy.
A tracheotomy. Now, I perform those. I know what a tracheotomy is. Yeah. So they put a breathing catheter in your trachea so that you don't have to have an ET tube or an intubation tube. Anyone know what a trichotomy is, though? Okay, so a trichotomy is three parts of one entity or one whole. So three parts of one entity or whole. And so they would claim that man is three parts of one entity or whole, and that he has a body. I think all of us would agree with that, right? He has a spirit. The Bible's fairly clear on that. And that he has a soul. And they would understand the soul as a separate entity to body and spirit. Now, everyone believes that man is body and spirit. No one disagrees with that. But what the soul actually is where the disagreement comes. People who don't believe that the soul is really a separate entity would believe man is a dichotomy, two parts, and others would believe three parts. And this is definitely not worth arguing over. In fact, it can get into very silly realms of debate. But those who hold to the view that man is a trichotomy would say that our personhood being in three parts is essentially a mirror of the essence of God being in three persons, right? Three. Y'all get that? But here's the problem with that. The problem is when you start to define what those three parts actually are. Okay, so in other words, we all know what a body is. That's not in the debate. Okay, we got that one. That's pretty clear. Okay, so the next one is what is a soul? Oh no.
It's that. No, I'm kidding.
That's perfectly fine. It's not bothering me.
Sounds like a cell.
I mean, it's like we're in someone's house or something. Perfectly fine. Alright, so what is a soul? When we say a person's soul, what are we referring to?
An eternal essence.
Okay, he says an eternal essence. Okay?
Essence of his being.
An essence of his being. Okay, and how would that distinguish from spirit then?
Isn't your soul more of your emotional makeup rather than your spirit is different from your soul, isn't it?
Well, I'm not arguing one way or the other about spirit and soul at this point. I'll get into that later. But, because I think it's extremely complicated that you have to look at more facts than that. But, so that kind of shows you my hand a little bit. But a soul is usually agreed upon by those who either are a trichotomy or a dichotomy, that the soul is our mind, emotion, and our will. I think that's where Shane was going. So our attributes of person is expressed through our soul. So every time the soul is actually used in the Old Testament, I would vouch for that. It's actually referring to some type of feeling or emotion or thought that the person is having. Okay, you'll see that. Now, a lot of times, soul and spirit are used interchangeably in the Old Testament. Sometimes they seem to be distinguished, but most of the time, the soul is in relation to a person's thoughts or intent or emotions. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a soul. The spirit, though, is difficult. It's very fluid in the Bible, and so it's really hard to nail down what the spirit is, and it's kind of used in different ways, in different demographics, and it's really kind of difficult to nail down a clear theology when it comes to the spirit. But most would agree that the spirit in man began when God breathed into his life, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Okay, that's when man became a living soul, and this spirit was actually given to man by God's breath, and then it was passed on, by procreation. Okay, does that all make sense? If anyone's holds to a trichotomy view that believes the spirit is anything different than what I just said, you please speak, because I don't want to misrepresent anyone that holds to a trichotomy view. But everything I've ever read, most believe that it began with the breath of God, and so it's kind of synonymous with God's breath. Okay, everybody okay with there? Okay, so then here's the question: could we say that those things are in animals? That's the question. Does anyone doubt that animals have bodies?
No.
All right. Does anyone doubt that animals have souls? Does an animal have an emotion? A will? Mine has a will. A will opposite of its master.
They have their own personality.
And they have a personality. Yeah, they have a mind, they have emotion, they have a will. Right? So, in that regard, if by their own definition of soul, animals have them. Okay? Do animals have a spirit is the second question. Okay? Well, they do. And I'm going to show you some verses of the Bible that prove that. Okay? So if you turn with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 7, verse 15. This is pretty much a slam dunk case when we get to this portion of Scripture. So you know the story. This is the flood. God was very angry with some people living on the earth. He told Noah to build an ark, and he was going to wipe out anyone who doesn't get on the ark. Right? Y'all know the story. And God tells Noah that he's going to send the animals to the ark 2 by 2. Now verse 15 picks that up. It says, and they went, talking about the animals, in unto Noah into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the what? Breath of life. That word there, breath there, is the Hebrew word ruach. Okay, and that Hebrew word is always in relation to breath or spirit or anything like that. So when we're talking about the ruach of man, we're talking about his spirit that lives within him. The breath that God breathed into the nostrils of man, that was the ruach of God. Okay, same thing here. All right, you should say ruach. It's really fun. It actually feels good running off the tongue. Ruach. Go ahead and say it. Go ahead and say it. Go say it. Say it. Yeah, see, it feels good, doesn't it? All right. All right. So the breath of life was in animals. I'm just trying to wake y'all up a little bit. All right. So in that regard, animals, by that definition, would also be a trichotomy. If you hold to man being a trichotomy, then you'd have to also own up to the fact that animals were a trichotomy. And if animals are a trichotomy, they are not distinguished from humans in that regard, right? So therefore it cannot be that a trichotomy means that they were made in the image of God. Whether you believe that man is a trichotomy or not is unimportant at this point. It cannot mean that as a distinguishment of being made in God's image, since animals have the exact same makeup. Okay? Now, animals have a higher intellect, higher capacity for relationship. They are moral, cognitive beings. Humans have more of a capacity for moral cognition than animals are. I'm not saying they're on the same par by any means, okay? But the essential parts, if you give that or contribute that to man, you have to also contribute those essential parts to the animals. Does that make sense? Okay. So then what in the world could it mean? Anybody have an idea? What does it mean to be made in the image of God then?
That was my original question.
All right. Well, John doesn't know because he wanted to know. All right. So I believe this verse tells us, if we just let it speak for itself. It says, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Okay. And then you see that full colon. You see that? That's nicely given to us by the translators. And why would there be a full colon there? Come on, use your grammar skills.
Create a list of things.
But what are full colons for?
It's been too long since I've been in elementary school.
Well, I didn't learn about the full colon in elementary school, but I did learn it at some point. Maybe I did, I don't know. Alright, so the full colon means that what has been said previously is related to what is saying afterwards. So this is true because this is being said, right? That's what the full colon means in grammar. So in this case, the fact that that man is being made in God's image is further clarified after the full colon with the next statement. And where he says, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over all the cattle and then so forth. So the image of God in man means that man was made to be a representative of God's dominion and power. That's what it means. So as God is given dominion over all things, man has come under that dominion and therefore has dominion over the realm of which he exists in, i.e., the earth, the fowl, the fish, the cattle, and so forth, right? The realm in which he lives in, he has dominion over. Just as God has dominion over all things, man has dominion over his realm. Does that make sense? Okay? So that is the idea there. That is why, and I almost want to get up and preach here, but that is why when you get to the book of Colossians chapter 1, and you get to about verse 13, it talks about Jesus being the firstborn in the image of God. Y'all familiar with that? Kind of? Okay. And it goes on to explain what that means. It means that all things are given under His dominion, so that He has preeminence over everything. So Jesus being made in the image of God doesn't just mean that He reveals to us God's attributes, and He does do that because He is God. That's how He's able to do it. But the writer's understanding of being made in the image of God has more to do with the fact that Jesus is made a dominionarian over all things. Okay? He has dominion. That's what firstborn is. Firstborn is in relation to His resurrection. So He was resurrected to a position of preeminence. The firstborn is a title of preeminence. Okay? You can see that in Genesis 49, where Reuben is called out by Jacob, and he said that you are my firstborn, and he says my might, my power. Okay? So firstborn is a title of preeminence. He was given that as being the firstborn among the dead. So Jesus being resurrected in preeminent power is the first to be exalted to that position. All of us one day will be brought to that position, but it'll be at a later time when Jesus returns. Okay? And that's kind of fast and a lot of doctrine being thrown at you real quick. But that is the understanding of being made in God's image. And that is, man has been given dominion. Alright? That makes sense? Alright. So the psalmist in chapter 8, if you turn with me, This verse will be used quite a bit. When we get into chapter 3 and we talk about the dominion of dominion of man being lost through his sin, we're going to be going back to this verse, and then we're going to see how this verse is used in a few other places in the Bible. But in Psalm chapter 8 and we'll start in verse 4. It said, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet." And then he goes on to say, "All sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, and the fowl of the air, and of the fish." And he repeats all of that. And verse 9 says, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth." And so the psalmist here began to look at the creation. Okay, so David most likely wrote this while he was a shepherd. Okay, and he probably was on sheep watch, gazing at the stars, and he was mind blown at God's imminent power when he looked at the creation. And he thought to himself, wow, when I look at all of these things that your hands have made, and then I look at us, I think, I don't get it. I mean, why are you so concerned with us? And look at all that you can do, all that you have done, and you're so mindful of man. And then he says about man that you have crowned him with glory and honor. And then he goes on to say, because you have given him dominion over all the works of your hand. And so the crowning of glory and honor is in relationship to the fact that God made him to have dominion over all things. So when God made Adam in his image and gave him dominion, he also crowned him with honor and glory. So image equals dominion. Dominion equals honor and glory. You see that? Now that's a good foundation to lay here, and remember that. Now we're going to build on that at a later point, but just know that this, when it talks about the glory and honor given or bestowed on man, we're talking about the fact that God made him in his image and gave him dominion. Okay, it's an important biblical truth that you follow away, you'll see it used again. Any questions about that? All right. Let's move on. There's a whole lot more I want to say, and I intended to say a whole lot more about that. And I will get to more on that. But I scrapped it because I want to get to chapter 3, look at the fall of man, and then look at man's dominion in relation to that. Okay, so we will get back to that topic. All right, just want you to know that that is what it means to be made in God's image, and the fact that He gave him dominion. Also, if you want to follow this away, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7, Paul associates the glory of man also with his dominion. Okay, so those are used interchangeably in that verse. Something for you to look at a different time. Alright, so we'll carry on with this verse. It says, and God said, let's make man in our image. Then in verse 27 it says, so God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him. Male and female created He them. Now this is going to be further elaborated on when we move into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a very detailed look at this act of creation. Okay, and we'll make sure that that is well believed before we move into chapter 2. But there's no doubt that chapter 2 is basically an exhaustive treaty on what he says in brief in chapter 1 about creation of man. Okay, they're the same thing, and we're going to see that clearly. But in this case, it just in passing says that He not only created man, but He created created mankind, male and female. Okay, so this tells us that it wasn't just man who was created in the image of God. Now I say that really laughing because there are people who believe that. People who do actually believe that only the image of God is related to man and not woman at all. Okay, that's not going to work. It doesn't work out. And the reason why is because there is the reason that's given to Noah when he establishes a covenant of government in the governing of murder. He says that obviously he's against anyone who takes another person's life. And then he says why? Because why was he against that?
We were made in the image of God.
That's exactly right. It says because man was made in the image of God. So if you don't believe that women were made in the image of God, essentially you're saying that we can murder them. Anyone believe that? No one believes that. Right? Women also are made in the image of God. All of His progeny are made in His image. And this is how. It's by default. So God created Adam in His image. All right. Out of the image of Adam came the woman. All of their children are made after the image of their parents. And thus, God's image is being passed down to all generations throughout all time. Okay. So all of us are part of that. Now, dominion, and we're going to get more into this. Dominion has to do with coming under dominion. Okay, and I'll give you a good example of that. You remember in Luke chapter 7, where Jesus is was talking to the centurion. Remember, and he has a servant who's sick, right? And so he goes to Jesus and he tells Jesus that his servant is sick to heal him. And Jesus starts to go towards the house. And what does the servant say to him? What does the centurion say to him? Excuse me. Centurion says something to Jesus as he tries to make his way to the house. Do you remember? No one remembers?
Something about not being worthy?
Yes, he says, no. Do not come to my house. I am unworthy for you to come to my house. But he says, but say in a word, and my servant will be healed. Remember? And he says, for I am too a man set under authority, and I can tell someone to go hither or go there, right? To go this way or go that way, right? He said, I know that you too are set under authority, and you can do the same thing. And Jesus marvels. He said, I have not seen such a faith, no, not in all of Israel. Now, why was he so taken back? Because this man got what dominion was. Okay? So in other words, and this we're going to make this really make sense when we get into chapter 3. But Adam came under God's dominion, and therefore he had his own dominion because he was under God's dominion. Just like that centurion had a dominion in Rome because he came under Roman authority. Right? Because he was set under authority, he had an authority to tell this person to go there or go that way or go that way. He recognized that Jesus too also was a man under that authority. He was under the authority of the Father. He put himself in that position as a human. As a human, he came under the authority of the Father, and therefore he had an authority to tell whatever he wanted to go this way or that way. Right? Jesus could tell the storms to cease, or he could tell diseases to go away. Right? The centurion couldn't do that, but he wasn't under that type of authority as Jesus was under. Adam came under God's authority, and therefore he had that dominion. The woman comes under Adam's authority. Right? That's how the husband-wife relationship works. They have an authority too. Their authority is under the husband authority. Okay? Y'all see how that works? That's the whole point in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 with covering. We're not going to get into that, but that's what the whole head covering idea has to do with. Okay? Is the representation of that coming under authority. We'll make all that make sense when we get to that part in Corinthians. But that is the idea here. When you move out from under that authority, then you have no authority.